On April 7, 1994, in Rwanda, horrific events began, as a result of which, in less than 3 months, in an area smaller than the Moscow region, 1 million people were brutally killed. But what's strange is that after one generation, Rwanda has become one of the most peaceful and rapidly developing countries in Africa. Let's figure out what led to the tragic events that are called the genocide in Rwanda. Little is known about Rwanda to the average person. It's even hard to find it on the map. The people of the country of Rwanda, in whose honor it was named, consist of 3 national groups, the most numerous Hutu, making up about the population Tutsi, and very few Pygmies Twi. It should be noted here that the Hutu are farmers who came to this land in search of new arable lands. Their skin is brown, they are of small stature and quite strong in body. Later, the Tutsi cattle herders began to move in from the north, who came and took most of the power into their own hands, despite being outnumbered. The faces of the Tutsi resemble more of the Somalis or Ethiopians, taller than the Hutu, practically black. Both tribes speak the same language, and, at first glance, they look almost indistinguishable. From the middle of the century, several tribal principalities formed on the territory, which by the end of the century merged into a single kingdom under the rule of the Tutsi. The farthest territory was discovered by Europeans, led by the British general John Speke, and later conquered by the Germans. As a result of the First World War, the territory of the kingdom became a mandate territory of Belgium. The arriving Europeans noticed that the Tutsi looked more like Europeans than the Hutu and Pygmies. Not only did they fail to remove them from power, but they actively encouraged them. When colonial rule ended, it provoked a reaction from the majority Hutu population. The Tutsis were stripped of power and they began to be persecuted. Soon, in neighboring states, numerous Tutsi settlements emerged, who were not willing to reconcile with the loss of their homeland, formed military organizations and carried out raids on Rwandan territory. To some extent, this was even convenient for the Hutu elite in power. The image of an enemy who has lost power and is secretly operating from across the border helped to show that if the current rulers are not supported, the former colonial masters will take over. Moreover, their compatriots still live in the country as before. In principle, this did not pose too much of a threat to the Tutsis who remained in Rwanda. They lived side by side with the Hutus, and the relations were as varied as they usually are between neighbors. However, at some point, real grounds appeared for the fears that had suddenly existed among the Hutus. The authoritarian regime of President Juvenal Habyarimana was showing increasing incompetence, and the people of Rwanda had grown tired of him over 2 decades. The demands for democratization forced questions about the rights of national minorities. At this point, one of the military groups of Tutsi refugees, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, began military operations. The Rwandan Patriotic Front was led by the current president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame. After conducting several raids on Rwandan territory, it decisively defeated the National Army and imposed tough political agreement conditions on Habyarimana. According to them, Tutsi refugees were to begin returning to the country, and Rwandan Patriotic Front representatives received 50% of the seats in the government and army. This was literally a realization of the Hutu nationalists' fears about the return to power of the minority they despised. Seeing the state was powerless, they took matters into their own hands. In the country, nationalist factions began to form, and harsh propaganda against the Tutsi was launched. Youth combat groups appeared, which trained and armed the military. Chauvinistic leaflets began to spread with calls to destroy the Tutsi. But since the majority of the country's population was illiterate, radio had far greater popularity. In the 90s, Rwanda was such a poor country that the majority of the country's residents used radio as a means of mass information. A person with their own television there was considered wealthy, and most Rwandans could only watch television in the windows of stores that sold these televisions. On April 6, 1994, a plane was shot down on approach to Kigali, on board of which was the president of Rwanda, Juvenal Habyarimana. He was just returning from negotiations in Tanzania. where ways to resolve the conflict were being discussed. Who orchestrated this act is unknown, but it was precisely after this event that mass killings and chaos began. Hutu radicals killed the Prime Minister, her husband, and 10 Belgian soldiers guarding them. Moreover, politicians who called for peace with the Tutsi were killed. The military came to power, who created a propaganda network against the Tutsi, a force that even Goebbels would have envied. The main agitational slogan sounded like this: "Kill these cockroaches." We all heard that propaganda is a deadly weapon. Yet many believe this is an exaggeration. But the story of the radio station Radio Thousand Hills speaks otherwise. The name for the station was not chosen randomly. Rwanda has a very complex terrain and is covered with hills. Because of this, the level of radio signal reception can vary greatly even in neighboring villages. The radio station, which belonged to the Hutu, not only called for the murder and maiming of neighbors from the Tutsi people, but its dictators also read out the names and addresses of people who were enemies of the people. Many of those whose data was broadcast on the air were killed, maimed, or raped. At any cost, all Inkotanyi, members of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, must be exterminated in all corners of the country. Even those of them who managed to run to the airport or the embassy should be deprived of life on the spot. Someone will pretend to be a refugee, someone will impersonate a patient, someone a nurse. Watch both, because they know many tricks. Should we look for parents in refugee camps who sent their children to the Federal Republic of Germany and killed them? I think yes. So said on the morning broadcast of May 23, 1994, the radio host Habiman Kantano, and he was not alone. HUD's processing took 24 hours a day, without days off. Everyone from children to the elderly were hated next door. The other dictator taught to recognize the enemy by external signs. We will kill and destroy them all. We will succeed because they all belong to this ethnic group. You need to look at the person's physique and appearance. If you see a small nose, break it. If necessary, we will spend a year fighting these cockroaches. We will exterminate them all. Then the so-called 10 Commandments of Hutu were published, which were repeatedly broadcast on propaganda radio channels. They proclaimed the following: the first betrayer will be considered anyone who marries a woman. Tutsi befriends her, takes her as a mistress. Second, Hutu daughters are more suitable for the role of wife and mother. Third, Hutu women, be vigilant and call your husbands and brothers to reason. 4. Every Hutu should know that the Tutsi are dishonestly conducting affairs. Therefore, anyone who will be a partner of the Tutsi will become a traitor. All strategic duties, political, administrative, economic, and military, can only be entrusted to the Hutu. In the education system among school children, students, teachers, Hutu should prevail. The armed forces should consist only of Hutu. No soldier can marry a Tutsi. Hutu should not feel pity for the Tutsi. Hutu, wherever they may be, must be united and solidary. They must think about the fate of their brothers. The Hutu ideology must spread at every level. To every Hutu, any Hutu who hinders this is a traitor. In some places, the reception of the propaganda radio was excellent, while in others there was no signal at all. As such, radio's impact on the populace could be ascertained with great precision. According to the results of further investigations, it turned out that in the areas where the radio worked, there were 10% more victims among the Tutsi. Therefore, if we assume that the number of genocide victims was 1 million, at least 100,000 of them were on the conscience. Radio Thousand Hills. Well, of course, this assessment is not final. Even in villages without radio access but close by, there was also an unusually high rate of Tutsi killings. Because the retelling of propaganda, amplified by neighbor gossip, made them grab machetes and exterminate cockroaches. The mass weapon of this war became the machete in the year 1993. Businessman and journalist Kabuga and other hardliners against the Tutsi imported machetes into Rwanda in far greater quantities than needed for agriculture, and also other tools that could be used as weapons. such as garden hose, saws, and knives. These tools were distributed throughout the country as if for civil defense. They destroyed not only the military here, but also representatives of the civilian population. The army distributed machetes for this purpose for free. They checked documents on the roads, where nationality was indicated at that moment. If a person was Tutsi, they were usually killed on the spot. They spared neither children, nor the elderly, nor women. In fairness, it should be said that some Hutu citizens were much more humane. Risking their own lives, they saved Tutsi refugees from certain death. The story of hotel manager Paul Rusesabagina is well known, who, using his high social status and financial resources, sheltered hundreds of people in the hotel. The executioners searched all the houses for Tutsis. Their homes were burned, and their property was looted. The Tutsis, in turn, tried to find refuge in schools and churches. Some priests hid them, while others turned them in. Many Tutsis were killed or betrayed to their murderers by their own neighbors, friends, and colleagues. It's important to note that not only Tutsis were targeted, but also so-called moderate Hutus who hid the persecuted or sympathized with them. Tutsi women were usually first raped, then killed. Many of them, having survived the violence, are now infected with acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The Tutsis sought help from UN peacekeepers, but they could not use their weapons as it would mean direct intervention according to their mandate. The Hutu fighters took advantage of this situation, killing people one by one. Europeans and Americans evacuated their citizens and did not interfere in the conflict. The Clinton administration opposed the UN mission, after which the Security Council ordered peacekeepers to immediately leave the country. Out of 2,500 soldiers of the Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, only a couple remained. Showing courage and heroism, defying orders from superiors, the general and his soldiers defended the Tutsis to the end, creating special shelter zones. The massacre stopped after the Rwandan Patriotic Front fighters, under the leadership of Paul Kagame, took Kigali in July, and the overthrown Hutu government fled to Zaire. According to official data, about 1 million people died in 100 days of fighting. Kagame subsequently took the post of Vice President of Rwanda and Minister of Defense, and in 2000 he became the president. Having been re-elected several times, he achieved a doubling of gross domestic product development of the economy and technologies. Unsurprisingly, in modern Rwanda, many consider Kagame a national hero. Justice prevailed, and although hatred did not disappear anywhere, it was possible to stop mass killings. In November of 1994, the UN organized an international tribunal on Rwanda. The guilty are found and judged to this day. During the International Tribunal on Rwanda, thousands of guilty were called to account. Among them were the leaders of the radio Thousand Hills. They all depicted devastation, blamed the government and their own incompetence. Most journalists received long prison sentences. Some, for example, dictators Bernard Mukengo and Valery Bomeric, received life sentences. In court, Valery Bomeric, in his last words, said the following: "I called for the hunt to kill Tutsis. I was supposed to name on air the places where they were hiding." The organization of the genocide was very meticulous. We received information about their whereabouts at all levels. We explained on the radio that the Tutsis are hiding in order to later attack the Hutus. We committed a terrible folly. We were not vigilant. Yes, we believed what our authorities said. We trusted them. We admit that we have sinned. So today we kneel and ask for forgiveness. Unfortunately, Habiman Kantanu, the chief propagandist, managed to escape from the justice of the star of the deadly radio station. He was not the dark, beaten, and deceived person like Bomariki Kantanu. He was from a well-off Hutu family, close to the ruling circles. He graduated with honors from a school in the capital of Rwanda, Kigali, and then studied in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Habimana mastered the art of propaganda at the journalism faculty of Leningrad University. Having returned home, the qualified specialist for some time published a nationalist newspaper. On the Thousand Hills radio, he immediately became a key figure. Contrano skillfully manipulated the listeners, using jokes, excursions into history, and quotes from the greats in his broadcasts. Although the propagandist managed to flee to the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo and even took with him the wealth amassed in blood, fate still caught up with him. A few years later, he died of acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And quite recently, on October 10, 2012, before the court in The Hague stood the Rwandan businessman and politician Felicien Kabuga. This man was the founder of Radio Thousand Hills and fully financed it. Kabuga, like Kantanu, managed to escape in time. He fled to Europe and successfully hid from justice for 23 years. He was arrested in 2020, not far from Paris. The criminal became careless, thinking that he had been forgotten. Kabuga was an influential man in Rwanda. His actions were deliberate and rational. He gave one daughter to the president's eldest son and the other to the son of the future co-conspirator of the genocide's planning minister. This ensured his 24/7 protection and the security of his positions. In 1993, Kabuga bought and brought into the country 500,000 machetes and other agricultural tools in cash, which is far cheaper than firearms. It does not immediately draw attention to the impending events and is safe for the government itself. Another stage was the financing and mobilization of the Hutu as an illegitimate mercenary formation. Under the name Interahamwe, Interahamwe means those who work together. Subsequently, on the radio, thousands of hills worked together became a signal for raids with machetes and the extermination of the Tutsi. Then Kabuga opened his own free radio and television, Thousands of Hills, where he became an investor and general director. In his broadcasts, as is widely known, Tutsis were dehumanized, called cockroaches, and their killing was considered an act of patriotism and defense of sovereign democracy. Felicien Kabuga hid for 23 years, changed several countries, names, and passports. The United States of America announced a reward of $5 million for information about him. And only recently, the 86-year-old fugitive was arrested in a respectable suburb of Paris. After all these bloody events, there was a change in the elite. A flow of Western investments and humanitarian aid began, and the activities of charitable organizations expanded widely. In accordance with the official ideology, there are no longer tribal divisions in the country, there are only Rwandans, a single nation. And yet, how exactly did they manage to survive and process such an experience? What actions were taken in the first days after the end of the genocide? The most active killers, aware of the consequences, fled the country. They were joined by hundreds of thousands of ordinary Hutus who were simply afraid for their future. But others stayed in their places and now faced the victorious Tutsis, not knowing what would happen next. Do I need to explain that the first acts were revenge? The Rwandan Patriotic Front soldiers dealt with those they suspected of involvement in the genocide. However, most of those suspected of crimes were not killed, but sent to prisons. Soon, 120,000 such suspects had accumulated in places of detention. At that time, about 6 million people lived in Rwanda. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, having taken power, faced an extraordinarily difficult question: how to govern a country where your people have just been massively killed? Perhaps simply understanding that a minority cannot rule? With the help of terror, the authorities managed to hold back from the most destructive impulsive decisions and terror. The riots over Hutu were quickly stopped, after which a complex, multi-step work began in the country to overcome the recent brutal experience. First of all, the authorities began a program of civic education. Citizens of all ages were sent to educational camps. There, where teachers read to people with different levels of education and life experience. Lectures about Hutu and Tutsi being one people who were divided by white colonizers. It's hard to say how convincing such instruction was for those Rwandans who were used to thinking otherwise. However, perhaps the mere fact that people were simply explained how to relate to each other now, after all that had happened, was an important signal for someone. Programs about the unity of the Rwandan people and the tragedy of the genocide were mandatorily included in the school curriculum. The authorities did not intend to forget about the recent mass murders, but they also did not plan to turn the investigation into a witch hunt. Faced with the miraculous task of how to assess and how to judge the massacre, in which hundreds of thousands of people were involved one way or another, they took an ambiguous approach. The examination of the circumstances of the genocide was entrusted to special Gacaca courts, which were composed of judges without special legal education. Similar tribunals were established in every village. The trials were held in the presence of the residents. Participation was essentially mandatory. Victims of the perpetrators accused each other and were made to tell what happened. Such hearings were in some sense a form of collective therapy. The confession and exposure of the perpetrators was considered a circumstance that significantly mitigated the sentence. From 2002 to 2012, such courts issued 120 million sentences. They reviewed all the episodes that people could remember as much as possible. The sentences were issued quickly, but considering the circumstances of their issuance, they were relatively lenient. Only 3% of the defendants were recognized as active participants and organizers of the genocide and sentenced to long prison terms from 30 years to life imprisonment. Almost 70% of the sentences were related to the looting of Tutsi property. And in this case, the courts reconciled the perpetrators and victims, determining measures of compensation for losses. For example, looters were made to build new houses for the victims. Ordinary participants in the killings received prison terms of up to 20 years. However, a voluntary confession, especially made before the start of the trial, halved the sentence. In addition, half of the remaining sentence could be replaced with community service, and in many cases, those sentenced were conditionally released from punishment after a few years. Such processes cannot be called legally flawless. However, reminiscent of popular revolutionary justice, they did not become a tool of terror. For the most part, the country was turned into a re-education camp for many years with a relatively soft regime. Such is the tragic and at the same time instructive story. And for today, thank you all for watching and see you in new episodes on our channel.